Welcome everyone to Pontos Fathom Press. This is our Pontos Fathom podcast, episode number 54. And today we're going to be talking about the Uranian astrological cycle. So, planet Uranus, ruling astrology, topics around revolution and transformation. And also we're going to dig into some things that we've seen on the table here. Dane Rudyard talking about the great year of astrological Uranus. So yeah, it should be very interesting. We've been doing a number of podcasts. We've talked about Saturn, a number of podcasts on Saturn, relating them to things like anime, popular culture, fiction. Then we went through the planet Neptune. Now we're making our way to the planet Uranus, which usually is symbolized as the planet of revolution, of change, ruling science. We'll also go into the moons of the planets as well. So we'll go into the moons of Uranus through this. But mostly we want to talk about, similar to what we did with the Saturnian cycle and the Neptunian cycle, we want to take these outer planets that have vast orbital cycles and map it back through history to get a bit of a feel of where history has taken us through each of these great cycles, and have this concept of the great year that Dane Rudyard talks about. We've also got Swami Sri Yukteswar's The Holy Science on the table, guru of Yogananda, and he has, we've talked about his work before, but he does talk about cycles of Kali Yuga, the various yugas, and he's got diagrams of this so we can go into those. We'll read a little bit from Dane Rudyard's Astrological Timing, the transition to the New Age. And so let's jump into it right away. Let's talk about Dane Rudyard himself as an astrologer, 20th century astrologer. He worked on the interpretation of the planet Uranus in astrological, it's called symbolism, and he saw it as a planet of individualization, of transformation, and also the breaking down of old forms to make way for new things, right? So it's kind of got this idea of Shiva. It's kind of got a Shiva-like vibe to it, right? So we'll put Shiva there. Uranus being sort of this revolutionary and transformative engine, the astrological solar system, and he's sort of as a harbinger of change and progress. So we'll kind of take some look through his insights into astrological Uranus. But let's talk quickly just about the idea of the great cycle of Uranus. So he talks about it here in the book. He talks about the great cycle. The cycle of Uranus. Planetary cycles. Uranus's trip around the sun takes 84 years. And so what Rudyard starts to talk about is, well, what's the great year of Uranus? You know, how do we look at these successive cycles? Where's the stopping and end point? What's sort of like the yuga almost of the Uranus cycle, right? So he kind of goes through this larger rhythm, and he kind of breaks it out, saying, well, let's if we took 10,000 years and we broke it up with Uranus, we've got 84-year cycles. So when does the Uranus cycle begin? He says the 10,000-year period includes 120 Uranus cycles of 84 years, plus one extra period of nearly 84 years, which can be considered a seed period, linking two 10,000-year cycles together. It would have been the same meaning to the aforementioned Pythagoras as common in music, the amount by which a cyclical series of 12 fifths is greater than 7 octaves. Indeed, Uranus can be related symbolically to the musical intervals of the fifth, from C to G. C, G, because this interval is the foundation of the process of modulation from one tone to another. Likewise, Uranus represents essentially the power enabling man to ascend from one level of consciousness to the next level of consciousness. That is, to experience a true metamorphosis. So we talk a little bit here about these cycles, but let's think about it. If we go back, as he mentions, 12 orbits of Uranus, right, which would be about 1,008 years. So let's kind of go back. What would 1,008 years look like, right? So if we take the time of around, let's say just from 2023 back to 1015, the year 1015, let's kind of go across the continents a bit. So in Europe, we're sort of right in the middle of the Viking Age. So this is 12 orbits. So think about 12 Earth years ago. 12 Earth years ago, it was it was 2011. So take yourselves back to 2011. The Marvel MCU was just kicked off in I think 2009 maybe. You guys can check me on that with Iron Man. So think about 2011, where we were then. That's 12 years ago. Now imagine 12 Uranus years ago. That's 84 years each. So back in the year 1015, the Vikings were the Norse raids across the Atlantic were happening, British Isles, Northern Europe. So the age of the Vikings were coming to an end, actually. They're sort of starting to wane because what their exploration did was sort of they began to adapt away from the idea of Viking or pillaging, right? So in Europe in 1015, England was marking its response to the challenges of the Vikings. This is kind of take us back to that Ragnar Lothbrok period that the Vikings the Vikings TV series kind of, King Athelred and all of that kind of era. But also in Europe you have the Byzantine Empire, right? So Basil II was the emperor. There was campaigns against the Balkans, against the Bulgarians happening in the Byzantine Empire because of their expansionist era. If we look to Asia, right, we can see that China was in a huge cultural and technological and economic prosperity. India was in the Chola dynasty in power in the south. They had a huge navy and they had cultural contributions, and the Islamic world was expanding even into the Indian subcontinent. And meanwhile, in the Americas, the year 1000 is still the era of the Native Americans. A lot of the Mississippi tribes and the Plain tribes are starting to come about. In Mexico, the foundations were being laid for the Aztec Empire. And I think in Africa, you can look at places like North Africa, like caliphates in Cairo, or Ghana being a huge trade route nation. So East Africa was starting to trade. So, 1,000 years ago is huge swath of history for the Uranus cycle. But I think maybe it's more impactful if we take it year by year. So think of it as 12 Uranus cycles of 84 years. So we'll go back 84 years, 2023, back to 1939. World War II is kicking off. In that era is the atomic bomb era, right? We're laying the groundworks for what would be the dropping of the bomb. And after World War II, United Nations are found. So this is sort of the vibe back 84 years ago. Massive global war, but also the post-war era. Capping off the Depression, even capping off the boom of early 20th century art, culture, music, jazz comes out of this. Cubism, all the writings of a Joyce, something like this, right? So this is just one Uranian cycle ago, how much the world has changed. If we go back to a second Uranian cycle, now we're back to 1855. We're in the era of the Civil War, right? Civil War is 1861 to 1865. But also British Empire expanding at this time, right? There was also a Crimean War back two Uranus cycles ago. So just to put that back in perspective there. We go back 3 Uranian cycles. We've got the American Revolution, the French Revolution, steam power is being invented. That would end up marking the Industrial Revolution 50 years later. We go back a 4th Uranian cycle. Right now we're in 1780s. Back from the 1700s back to the 1680s. So 1680s, Sir Isaac Newton publishes his Principia Mathematica with the calculus. So we got Newtonian era beginning. We also have the War of Spanish Succession. This is a time of fleets and exploration. We go back to 1603. We've got the English Civil War. We've got the Qing Dynasty in China. And we have King James, Queen Elizabeth, William Shakespeare. Huge era, the turn of the century from 1590s to early 1600s. It's the Shakespearean time, Elizabethan times, and King James times. We go back a 6th Uranian cycle. Martin Luther, Protestantism 1517, the 100 Years' War, 1453 in the 7th cycle, right? Gutenberg, 1400s, the Renaissance, full swing, 1400s. Let's go back 8 Uranian cycles, 1350s, the Black Death in Europe, the Italian Renaissance beginning, the Ming Dynasty in China. Let's go back 9 Uranian cycles. Marco Polo travels the east. The Mongol Empire is at its peak. 10 cycles, we're in the Third Crusade. We're in the 1100s. The Khmer Empire from Cambodia. From Cambodia, from Khmer. I kept saying Cambodia. Khmer, yeah. The 1100s also have the Kamakura Shogunate in Japan. We go back to 1099. The first Crusades in Jerusalem. William the Conqueror. The Song Dynasty in China. Go back to 1015, where we started the Viking Age of exploration. Is still occurring, but starting to wane. The Byzantine Empire. So each period is a huge swath. So hopefully that gave you some kind of reference there. I'm going to go to Dane Rudhar's book here and talk about a bit of how he places it with the Uranus cycle. He continues. The mid-phase of the Great Cycle from 84. So now he's going to go back a second Great Cycle. So we take 12 Uranian cycles and we go backwards. So the first one gets us back to, he says, 922, which was the real beginning of the medieval church, the Piscean Age. And then the year before, we go back again to 84 BC. This is the Buddha, Pythagoras, the Assyrian Empire is destroyed, the New Babylon, the captivity of Israel, the rise of the new Persian Empire. The mid-phase of the Great Cycle from 84 BC to 1005 AD. And then Joan of Arc is 1424, which is back to that one. So this is interesting how we can go into these different ages, right? So now let's kind of take Holy Science. So Holy Science is, again, written by Swami Sri Yukteswar Giri. He's the guru of Pamanahasa Yogananda. And he had a concept of the cosmic cycle as well that sort of tried to map the yugas of Hindu science and map it to strict dates. So in this section, he talks about after 12,000 years, when the sun goes to the place in its orbit from the farthest of Brahma in the center, the event takes place with the autumnal equinox. Again, in the same manner, when the sun is on course of revolution, begins to advance toward the place nearest the grand center, Dharma, the mental virtue begins to develop. This growth is gradually completed in about 12,000 years. So you see that there's a large cycle of 12,000 years, and then we know 24,000 years is the cycle of Earth's precession of the equinox. If we take a look, though, at the great diagram that he has in this book, here, we actually can see that these cycles also relate to the physical body, the astral body, the causal body, and actually the heavenly space above. So let's take a comparison then. Let's quickly look at the contrast between, let's say, the Uranian Great Cycle and the Yuga cycles, as Yogananda talks about in the Holy Science. So first of all, the duration, right? The Uranus cycle is only about 84 years to orbit the sun, and it's related to changes, revolutions, the breaking of conventions. But the Yuga cycles are much longer. So Yukteswar's book interprets a complete Yuga cycle, ascending and descending, as 24,000 years. And then it's divided into the classic 4 yugas of Satya Yuga, the Golden Age, Treta Yuga, the Silver Age, Dwapara Yuga, the Bronze Age, and Kali Yuga, the longest, and the Black Iron Age, which also has a Saturnian influence to it. You know, iron and Saturn, right? Even the dragon glass kind of has a iron label to it here. So let's talk about the nature of the influence of each of them. We talk about the duration. Let's talk about the nature of their influence. First of all, the Uranus cycle is talking about revolutionary changes, upheavals, technological advancements, radical shifts. It's about transformation and generational scale. But the Yuga cycles, these are vast spiritual and intellectual evolutions, and even devolutions, right, of humanity. So as we move from the Satya Yuga to Kali Yuga, spiritual knowledge and human virtue decreases, and ignorance and materialism increase. So this is why it's really important for us to sort of have these talks together. I wanted to call out quickly before we keep going up. We've got a number of books on sale in our bookstore link below. If you guys like what we're doing here on the channel, please like and subscribe. You can check out our Patreon. But also we have some great books that I'd like to share with you guys just quickly. The Artificial Psychology of Desiring Machines. This is a 3-volume set by August Moldenhauer, Impedance and Admittance in Desiring Machines, Computational Complexity and Psychiatric Agency, and the Psychoanalysis of Artificial Intelligence. These are really timely given the state of AI. We've also got the collected Catu journals out of Lovecraft's Providence. This is a massive grimoire collecting the 6 volumes that you can also check out in the bookstore of the Lovecraft collection. This will look great on your shelf with other Lovecraft things. If you want to check out our podcast on this, you can go do that. And then lastly, we are on a path to bring these podcasts to you in book form. We've got the Jungian Alchemy and Horror and Science Fiction, talking about Lovecraft, Herbert, and Philip K. Dick. We've got the 2nd volume of the Pontos Fathom lecture series, Theosophical Psychoanalysis of Pulp Fantasy and Anime, Conan, Solomon Kane, John Carter of Mars, Evangelion, Bleach. And then those 2 are both in the wild. We've got the 3rd volume being edited, Esoteric Anthroposophy and Occulted History. So lots of exciting stuff coming on the channel. So be sure to go check out those sponsors, like and subscribe, leave your messages. Okay, that's enough for the ads. Let's go back into Sri Yukteswar. Oh, and by the way, all of our Patreons and subscribers, thank you so much for your support. It's much appreciated to help grow this channel. let's talk about the nature of the influence of the yoga cycle versus the Uranian cycle. So the Uranian cycle is much more abrupt, right? It talks about sudden changes, upheavals, technological advancements. I think of the rising AI is something of a Uranian event. I think if we could find a place where the AI emerges, I mean, this might be the year. We could almost count it here. This might be a great place to sort of mark Uranus and then do that back study. If anyone's interested in that, you'll leave a comment below if you want to share some insights on what you know about that cycle. But it's also about radical shifts and a generational change. You know, we talk about the different, I think when I grew up, we used to talk about decades, right? It was the 60s, the 70s, the 50s. I remember my parents would reminisce on growing up in the 50s. And then I would listen to like those old records of like the Beatles, or actually the old Elvis albums in the 50s, and then the early 60s was like the Beatles. And I remember I felt like time traveling back to that era. But we used to talk about decades more. Now we talk more about the generation. You know, there's the boomers, I'm a Gen X, there's Gen Y, Gen Z, there's millennials, Zoomer thing. And I think it's sort of changed more to like the year that you're in. So you can see how these cycles are still important. But this generational cycle that we're sort of talking about now, decades or the, what gen you are. If we talk about the Yuga cycles, this is much more like the evolution of humanity, right? So this is like human virtue decreasing. And I think we get a lot of insights from, say, like someone like a Rudolf Steiner talking about the Atlanteans and the Lemurians and these different ages of humanity. And to imagine that maybe things were much different if you go back enough of these cycles, especially when you look at the Yuga time scale, 24,000 years ago. One thing I always thought that was interesting, going back to the forthcoming, actually for Theosophical Psychoanalysis of Pulp Fiction and Anime, we have an essay about Conan and Theosophy. And it sounds like an odd mix, but the idea is that Robert E. Howard talked about the age of Conan, and it's almost anthroposophical when you read through it. It's like an age before written history, but there was high magic and civilizations and empires, and they've all been destroyed. And it's sort of like kind of taps into this revisionist history. It taps into the, with the discovery of places like Göbekli Tepe, they're revolutionizing what archaeology is. And you can see that there's a lot of narratives that people are starting to learn about. Okay, so let's talk about application of the Uranian cycle versus the application of the Yuga cycle. So for Uranus, a lot of it has to do with Uranus's transits and aspects to other planets. So we'll talk in a little bit about the Uranus-Saturn pattern and the Uranus-Neptune pattern when the conjunctions come. But I think that the application of the Uranus cycle, because it's 84 years, it only goes once around the sun. So even with the Saturn cycle, which is 29 years, 29 years is definitely a period that you can have your Saturn return a couple times in your lifetime. So you can kind of see what happens, in your late 20s, what happens in your late 50s, and then, if you're lucky enough, what happens in your last phase. But we only get 3 of those. With Uranus, we only get 1. We get 1 cycle, and we don't get another time around. It's almost like a generation. It's a generational marker almost. The yoga cycles are very different. We're talking about huge swaths of time here. So the application of the Uranian cycle is mostly around changes and revolutions in a life. In a life meaning within your lifetime. Where the Yuga cycles are more about understanding large cosmic and spiritual evolutions, right? So this is macroscopic human progress, millennia decline and millennial rising of that nature. Okay, lastly, I think we can talk about origins and frameworks around the Uranian cycle and the Yuga cycle. So Uranian cycle, definitely a modern astrological planet. It is not one of the planets known to the ancients. Saturn was that last planet. But in a weird way, and I probably should do a podcast on this too, Saturn is sort of differentiated now as an outer planet, the ancient world and the modern world. I think there's a lot to be said in the work of, I've talked about it before, Liz Green's Saturn and Neptune work is great. And I think also Dane Rudyard's work is great. To talk about the Uranus cycle tied to the physical orbit of the planet around the sun in Western astrology, through the transits, through all those powers. With the yogic cycle, it's a very metaphysical concept. The rise and fall of human consciousness is at play in this one. And I think as we go through this, we can start to look at Uranus in a different way when we relate it to the other planets. I mean, I think if you look even within Uranus, here I've got this old painting I did with Uranus as the higher octave of the sun. I had this old photo. This was Kodak, printed on Kodak paper, taken by a real camera. This is actually the painting that's the cover of this book. Well, you can see that astrological book. Okay, so if you take a look at the moons of Uranus, just talking about maybe an overview of Uranus from this perspective. Uranus is the planet that brings change. It is called the Awakener. It is the symbol of the highest energy of all. It is the ruler of the heavens. It also gives insights into the working of the cosmos and other assigned traditionally to the sign it rules, Aquarius. Mythologically, Uranus was the offspring of Earth, whom she in turn married. Thus they began the cycle of materiality that the universe as we know it. First with their children, the Titans, and then with their more human but divine grandchildren, the Olympians. Uranus himself was overthrown by his son Saturn, who castrated his father with a sickle, and he was pictured with, in keeping with the tradition of Uranus as the higher octave, the Uranus system deals with communication. So there's a double higher octave. Some say that the Uranus is a higher octave of Mercury, others say it's the higher octave of the sun. There's also the idea of the angels and the myths of William Blake in the Uranian energy. The moons of Uranus are all named after Shakespearean characters. The Rig Vedas are often quoted saying the astrology is the eye of Brahma. When the planet has the way the ring of the planet goes around, it looks like the eye of Brahma. It was discovered in 1781 when Uranus transited the sign of Gemini. So that's our Uranian energy. I think it's also clear in the Uranus world of how much Uranus really is that first journey into modernity with Neptune of revolutionizing astrology, where we've never had these kind of we never had the ancients' view of the heavens ending at Saturn from the solar system point of view. So let's go into the Uranus cycle astrologically, and let's talk about that 84-year cycle and the way it transits with, say, Saturn and Neptune. I think that's kind of a good place to jump into. So I'd say that in this space, we can start off with the Uranus-Saturn cycle, and then we'll kind of go into the Uranus-Neptune cycle. So maybe high level we'll jump into astrological timings. But first off, the duration between the Uranus conjunction is about every 45 years. When the two planets are conjunction, that means that they're in the same sign as the zodiac. So the Uranus cycle deals with the tension between traditional Saturn and the revolutionary Uranus. So this is, again, an outer planet, ancient world, modern planet, modern world kind of distinction. When these two planets interact in significant ways, conjunction, squares, or oppositions, you often see structured Saturn as being challenged and then being redefined with innovative and revolutionary forces that the Uranian energy brings. So it's sort of the cycle of building, breaking, and rebuilding. Build, break, rebuild, right? And from a historical context, let's say if we go back to the last conjunction of Uranus and Saturn would be in the 1940s, which is sort of like World War II, the aftermath of World War II, formation of the United Nations. And then Uranus and Saturn were square back in the early 1970s, and there was a lot of social unrest, civil rights movement, post 60s, 1970s oil crisis. So a lot of this is the Uranian-Saturn cycle. So let's just jump into Dane Rudyard. Let's see what he sort of says about it. He says he does the great cycle of Uranus, and he talks a little bit about the keep going ahead a bit. Uranus-Neptune cycle. Let's see if he has a Uranus-Saturn cycle. No, he just does Uranus-Neptune cycle. He just does the outer planets. But I think we can see how the that historical cycle is interesting. 45 years conjunct. You see Saturn representing structure being challenged by revolution, right? So let's go into a little bit into the Uranus-Neptune cycle, which Rudyard does talk about. In the Uranus-Neptune cycle, this is about 172 years between each conjunction. And the cycle deals mostly with collective shifts in ideas, spirituality, imagination. So again, Uranus bringing the revolutionary energy to Neptune's spiritual realm. And this is like a time of artists or spiritual and social revolutions. So you can see that the 1990s had a conjunct of Uranus and Neptune. And I can think of this time, I always think of how the 90s had a real huge music boom that happened in the 90s, right? We had the grunge era and lots of techno era coming into this time, really advancing in the 90s, right? We're kind of coming out of that largesse of the 80s, which kind of mirrored the 1920s, but the 90s took that new aesthetic, that pre-millennial aesthetic forward. Right, we had the rise of digital technology, the rise of the internet, lots of cultural shifts, social shifts. And if you think back from the 1990s, the prior Uranus-Neptune cycle would be in the 1820s, and this would be like the Romantic movement in the arts, right? The Romantics. So if you look at these transits, it's not just about conjunctions, squares, and oppositions, although those are very important. I think with Uranus and Saturn and Neptune, you have to think of these individual cycles, right? And I think if we go to, I know Rudyard does talk about Uranus, Neptune, so let's maybe read a little bit of what Rudyard has to say here. The Neptune-Uranus cycle is interesting. So it says, the cycles of relationships of Uranus and Neptune are very significant because these two planets are in many ways complementary. Uranus is essentially the planet of individualism, referring to the hidden genius in every man and to its inspirational revelation. Neptune, on the contrary, is the symbol of collectivism and the presence of the collectivity upon the individual. Sefariel has a good deal to say about these conjunctions and refers particularly to the one which occurred in 1650, falling in Sagittarius 16th and 17th degrees. It was the time of Cromwell's dictatorship, and on 1666, the famous Great Fire destroyed a vast portion of the city. It's also around 1650 that marked the very end of the medieval political system from Japan and India. So the medieval systems were collapsing around the world at this time. When the Uranus-Neptune came again in the conjunction of 1821, Napoleon I died. Liberals struggled in Europe against the despotic governments which followed Napoleon's debacle, and in South and Central America, new republics emerged from the dominion of Spain and Portugal. The Mississippi Compromise marked the seeding of the Civil War. In 1823, the Monroe Doctrine established the ideal of Pan-Americanism. The Neptune-Uranus conjunction of 1821 was in March at 33rd degree of Capricorn. 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 33rd degree of Capri third conjunction would be 2163, falls a century after the time I've suggested as the beginning of the Aquarian Age. It will probably sound like the final death knell for the old world of European nationalism, seeds of the Piscean Age. So this is 2163, okay? Nations or geographical regions in which people of the same language are gathered most likely will retain their relative autonomous character as units of social management, but minus the separative political concept of absolute sovereignty, the modern equivalent of the divine right of kings against which men like Paine and Jefferson fought stubbornly. Wow, so some predictions there from Dane Rudyard. Very interesting stuff there, right? Okay, so let's kind of go back to, let's talk about those last three Neptunian Uranus-Saturn and Uranus-Neptune conjunctions. So that year, so we're going back to Uranus-Saturn conjunctions. 1988 conjunction occurred in the last degree of Sagittarius. Then go back to Uranus-Saturn conjunctions were in 1942 in Gemini. So again, this is World War II. And then 1918 when Uranus-Saturn conjunction was in Leo. So in 1988, we have the end of the Iran-Iraq war. We have the treaty signed on intermediate range nuclear force treaty between U.S. and USSR, still Soviet Union at the time. Pan Am Flight 103 bombed over Lockerbie. Gorbachev signs the Glasnost and Perestroika in the Soviet Union, and this is the death knell for the Soviet system and Soviet era. So we go back another Saturn-Uranus conjunction, 1942. World War II was going on, battles of Stalingrad. The Manhattan Project created the atomic bomb, and mass 20th century level of impact on human life by governments in wars with World War II and Stalinist time, Maoist time. So you see a lot of these kind of escalations and exterminations happening that are huge impact. Another Uranus-Saturn conjunction, and that might actually, that 1942 one might be an interesting one to mark. That if someone has some research on that one, leave a comment below. That's very interesting. 1918, 1919, end of World War I, the Spanish flu pandemic, and the Treaty of Versailles is signed. So lots of Uranus-Saturn, just those three leaps of those conjunctions. You can see that it's probably very influenced by the sign that the Uranus-Saturn conjunction is in. I find that 1919 one is pretty grim. So let's see how that works for the next one. Uranus-Neptune conjunctions 1993 was the European Union officially formed. World Trade Center initial attack happened. The first attack before the one that toppled the towers. Mandela's Peace Prize. Internet growing at this time. The dawn of the internet age. 1821. Greece gets independence from the Ottoman Empire, the Greek War of Independence, the Mississippi Compromise with the extension of slavery kicked off the Civil War. The Romantic movement in literature was thriving in Europe. Now we jump back all the way to the 1649, 1650, King Charles of England executed, Republic under Oliver Cromwell. Civil wars in France against the monarchy that would start the machinery that would end up 100 years later as the French Revolution. And Europe is still recovering from the impact of the 30 Years' War. So those are just some of those Uranus-Neptune conjunctions. So I thought maybe we would end this up with just a little bit of talk about the moons of Uranus and this idea of the moon astrology. I think this is a kind of interesting area. So we have Uranus has 27 known moons, and each of those have their own cycle. So the way the astrology of planetary satellites could work, and one idea I had of it was interesting, where it's like, if you think of how the Earth and the Moon work, as beings standing on the Earth, we can see the orbits of the Moon and how the Moon affects its motion, its circle, its circuit completes every 28 days. It's linked to the tides, etc. So there's certain rhythms. There's biological rhythms in the woman's cycle. There's the month, the division of the year, the way the tides are controlled daily by it. So all of these cycles are real. So I thought one way to think about the astrology of planetary moons is if you were to be on, say, the planet Uranus. So you're on Uranus and you have 27 moons. Imagine that we could recreate what the mythology of those moons are as they pass through whatever the constellations are from the planet, right? Maybe they're somewhat related to our constellation. Some of them might be a little bit different, right? Just from the angle and position of the planet. So that's one way I thought of approaching it. The other way I thought of it is just purely with the orbital idea. So we'll keep the moons as determiners of the state of Uranus. So Uranus cycles the zodiac, and we can relate our natal charts and our relationship charts to transits of Uranus and aspects of Uranus. But then if you add in this moon dimension, you can characterize Uranus as subcycles based on different chapters and different rulers. So for example, if we kind of go roughly through the moons of Uranus, we have the satellites are Cordelia, the chapter of freedom and humanitarianism, 0.3 days, third of a day. Ophelia, the chapter of impersonality and egoism. Bianca, independence and autonomy. Cressida, perception and intuition. Desdemona, unconventionality and the eccentric. Juliet, idealism, utopianism. Portia, genius, intellectualism. Rosalind, future, progressiveness. Belinda, resourcefulness, pioneering. Puck, rebelliousness, reform. Miranda, cosmic consciousness, divine will. Umbriel, astrology and the occult. Ariel, light, electricity, flying. Titania, creative will and the transcendental. Oberon, science and psychology. Right, so you get this kind of feel of these subdomains of the moons of Uranus. Since the publication of Moons of the Planets, a number of other moons have been discovered. So there is a book in the works. I have been told, having completed the disclosure from the Necronomicon fragment, Giuseppe Balsamo is planning a revisiting of Bensamagos' Moons of the Planets. It will be focusing probably a volume on each of the outer planets, Jupiter, Saturn, Neptune, Uranus, and then maybe a volume with the inner planets and the asteroids, and then Pluto and the Trans-Neptunian. So look forward to that. That's still in the works. It could be one volume. It could be a series of books. Still working through what his scope is. But yeah, if we think of those other moons, we talked about Miranda, Ariel, Umbriel, Titania, Oberon, Caliban, Sycorax, Prospero, Setebos, Stefano, Trinculo, Francisco, Margaret, Ferdinand, Perdita, Mab, Cupid, Portia, Rosalind, Belinda, Cressida, Desdemona, Juliet, Ophelia, Bianca, Cordelia, Caliban. So that is going to do it. That's going to wrap it up for our overview of the great cycle of Uranus. I think we'll kind of leave you guys with a final quote for the cycle of Uranus here that sort of frames it all. So he's talking about the great cycle. This is about the great cycle of Uranus. Knowing this may help us to pinpoint our position insofar as the processes which refer to the transformation and reorientation of our present-day society are concerned. A new cycle of Uranian changes has already begun. But this cycle must not be confused with the Aquarian age, of which we will soon speak, though in a sense the Uranian cycle is announcing, preparing the way the next century will blend with twice as long as the Aquarian age. So again, this is when you look at those great swaths of time. If you think of the Middle Ages, right, or Elizabethan England, this is a long stretch of time. So the Uranian age is a slow progress, a slow turning of the wheel, right? And I think those insights are very powerful. So guys, thank you for listening. Hope you guys, if you made it this far, very kind. Please like and subscribe. Leave your comments below. Would love to get this channel over 1,000 subscribers. Thank you guys for your support, especially the Patreon supporters, book buyers out there. I noticed you guys are buying these books. Thank you so much. And likes and subscribes and comments below are all much appreciated. So we will talk to you in the next podcast. Thanks for listening. Bye-bye.